Welcome to American Black Journal. I'm Stephen Henderson. The killing of an unarmed black teenager at the hands of a white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri ignited protests across the country. After several nights of violence, looting, and clashes with police in riot gear, peace has finally fallen on Ferguson as 18-year-old Michael Brown was laid to rest last week. But there are a lot of questions remaining. Where does the city go from here? What will the official investigation reveal about the circumstances surrounding the shooting? And how does Ferguson begin to repair the racial divide and tensions between the community and the police department? Here today to discuss the aftermath of the issues behind the death of Michael Brown are Detroit NAACP President Reverend Wendell Anthony, Detroit Assistant Police Chief James White, and Michigan State University Sociology Professor Dr. Carl Taylor. Thanks for being here. I want to start this conversation on a really personal note. You know, I watched the death of Michael Brown. I watched Trayvon a year ago. I watched these incidents sort of unfold. And as a father of a brown-skinned boy growing up in this country, the thing that I feel the most is fear. And I think that gets lost in some of this coverage sometimes, that if you are a black parent, you're scared about this stuff.
Well, Stephen, thanks for having this conversation. But let me just say this, you don't have to be a boy, you can be a man.
Yeah, right,
you know,
right?
You can be a woman.
Right.
It's not restrictive to age or gender. And unfortunately, it's a phenomenon that we have to deal with as African Americans. We find ourselves living beneath our privilege to the degree that we should not have to condition our children to the fact that when you grow up, beware of the police because your life may be in danger. We should be telling them to run to the police because they're in line security. However,
Right.
we don't do that. So if Barack Obama came out of the White House without his security team and just started running down streets in Washington, he'd be picked up. Right. And so the question becomes where we can sensitize our communities to the degree with community policing, with people who live in the community, who understand that you don't judge people just by virtue of who they are or what they look like, whether it's Trayvon Martin in Florida, whether it's Eric Garner in New York, right. Whether it's Ezell Ford in California, whether it's Trayvon Martin. The fact is that Michael Brown's situation says to the nation that we got a problem. And unless we begin to come together to deal with the problem, it's going to exacerbate as opposed to be eliminating.
Yeah. Chief, we just saw last week that Detroit finally emerges from federal oversight, principally for these kinds of issues with excessive force and people dying in custody, things like that. What would you say to Detroiters about what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, and how that relates to what's going on here? I mean, this stuff is somewhat familiar to people in this community. Are we moving forward?
Oh, we're absolutely moving forward. When you look at the Detroit Police Department over the past 11 years with the consent judgment, the reasons that the federal government came to Detroit to look at our practices, we were engaging in behavior that was improper with regards to conditions of confinement and uses of force.
Right.
I will say to you that there is no perfect police department, but we are certainly a better police department than we were 11 years ago. We have practices that are modeled by agencies across the country. We have looked at our agency from top to bottom. We have trained to some of the top-notch training around the country. We've looked at best practices with uses of force. We've trained our officers in those practices. We're engaging in a very aggressive audio-video program where all our officers will have audio and video equipped vehicles, and we're looking to supplement that now with body cameras. And the reason that we're doing all of this is for transparency. It protects not only the community, but it protects the officers.
Right.
I think that the best thing you can do in an organization is be transparent. As you know, our chief is very transparent. He gets in front of the issues when they come up. There's no way to just cover or clean something up. You have to let the community know this is what happened and this is what we're going to do about it. Yeah. So,
Dr. Taylor, your work is very important mostly about the relationships that we have among ourselves, really, as black people in the black community with black youth. This seems a very different kind of issue, right? The fear or the relationship between our community and the authorities, and a very confounding influence, I think, in the community itself.
Absolutely. I would, with all due respect to the chief and to good Reverend, I think that we are seeing something consistent and very troubling that has been going on for quite some time. Mm-hmm. We're talking about attitudes on both sides of the fence. That we seem to see a lot of officers that some are young, but some are old, many are old, with an attitude that is inhumane, and that's not being covered up. It's coming out to the surface. So I would agree that as a African-American male myself, as an old one, I'm concerned. But we need to talk also about the young men many times who have their own constitution. They're detached. And I think that we shouldn't scratch our heads. Public education has dwindled to nothing almost. Sure. We have no recreational centers. Reverend Dr. Anthony and I grew up together and I went to Central and Durfee, and so jobs were plentiful. And the neighbors also had input into our upbringing. You know, I would hope that Reverend Dr. Anthony's mother wouldn't call my mother. They call me. So people would laugh and say that I'm choking on nostalgia. But I think
but that was an important part of
we're talking, but we're also talking about a poverty that we have not seen in my lifetime. We're talking about people who will squat in a building. Some will try to get by and move on, and others will feel that they're correct to squat. Attitudes is what we're dealing with that I think have changed immensely. And I think the attitude of young men who are carrying guns many times and their parents make excuses for them. We're not talking about that. We're not talking about how young men interact with other young men. Again, I keep going back because he and I were at Central at the same time. Right. That the older brothers were guides. They were shepherds, you know. I'm a little older than him. You can see the gray beard.
That's true.
And yet he was a very energetic young man, both as an athlete, but as a leader, a student leader. We did a lot of self-policing. Yeah. So what we have now is a lot of guys that are a little bit older telling you that it's correct to beat women. It's correct to curse the women. It is correct to take on the police. We have to have good, strong policing. I guess where I will close, though, that I'm afraid the police departments are placed in a political position. I disagree strongly, in a political position to say that things are good when things are not good. Things are very bad, and they have gotten worse.
And in that sense, they're being asked to deal with a problem that they can't solve. The police, you can't solve poverty with policing. You can't solve hopelessness with policing. Sure. We need the police, but
you individually and singularly, no, they cannot. However, they are part of the equation. Mm-hmm. And Dr. Taylor Carl is certainly right, and that's why in our churches, mosques, temples, synagogues, we emphasize good behavior. We talk about responsibility. In our community, we have rites of passage programs for young black males and females. So we're doing, it's not enough, but there needs to be recreational situations. There needs to be jobs. In Ferguson, Missouri, I'm from St. Louis, Stevens, and I'm raised in a little town called Kinloch, 10 minutes from Ferguson. Right. My grandmother used to tell us, don't go to Ferguson, because if you go to Ferguson, police might pick you up and we will never see you again. Right. So we avoided that. It's not only Ferguson, it's Jennings.
So that's been going on then
absolutely.
Decades,
it's right? Jennings, it's Bellefontaine, it's Normandy, and the fact that the majority of the police do not live in the community in Ferguson. That's why the governor went and got Ron Johnson, right, who was a resident of Ferguson, to do some community policing. And unfortunately, the trend in Detroit is in the opposite way. Only 28% of the force live inside this community. Sure. The executive team, the sworn officers, executives, for the most part, do not live in this community. There's something to be said for that. Many folk need to go back and reread the Kerner Commission report on police community relations. Chapter 11 deals with this kind of situation, why it happened, where it happened, what can be done to prevent it from occurring again. It deals with unemployment. It deals with recreational facilities. It deals with police community relations and community policing. One of the things the chief does here is that he is in the community. However, singularly, To say that it cannot happen in Detroit is a misnomer. It can happen in Detroit.
Right.
But the difference is you got a Commander White, you got a Chief Craig, you
More
got some
responsive.
other folk who would come into the community. But to say that it cannot happen here is a misnomer, because it can happen here. And unless we put some steps in place, it possibly will happen here.
Right. Chief, I want to give you a chance to respond to that, but I'd like you to also sort of address this idea. You have no control over where the officers live. That's a state law that was overturned by the Supreme Court, said we can't force people to live in this community. But how do you guys see that from inside the department? How important is that to the things you're trying to do?
Well, I'd like to go back to something Dr. Said earlier with regards to police officers, and I will get to that question in a second, but I don't want to miss the opportunity to respond to that. Sure. With regards to police departments being put in a political position, having to say that things are great when they're not, certainly we recognize that things are not perfect, okay? But I'm not going to sit here and say things are wonderful or things are great. They're just better. And when I talk about the consent judgment and I talk about what's happening in the Detroit Police Department, they're better than they've been. Sure. There's a long way to go and there's a lot of work to be done. When we look at Ferguson and we look at Detroit, one of the things that I think when you look at Detroit and what's different in Detroit is the relationship we have with the community. When you look at the neighborhood police officers, when you look at the mandates that not only the chief, but the assistant chiefs, the deputy chiefs put on the captains to connect with the community. To be involved, sure. To have the community meetings, to be there. Not just lip service, not just a phone call, be there. I think that helps. And the police department, when we closed our precincts a couple years ago and went to the virtual precinct model, we had angry residents because they wanted to connect with the police department. They wanted to be able to walk into a precinct and interact with a police officer. That speaks to relationship building. Sure. That speaks to the police department being viewed as a safe haven. You go back 15, 20 years ago, it may not have cared much about closing a precinct door. Right. With regards to the residency issue, as you indicated earlier, it's a state law.
Right. You can't control it.
I can't control it. Here's what I can control. I can control the performance of the officers when they arrive in Detroit. I hear the numbers, 28% of our police force live in the city of Detroit. I haven't checked that number, but assuming that number is
that's the number.
Assuming that number is accurate.
That's the number.
100% of the officers are required to perform when they're here.
Right.
Treat residents with dignity and respect and do their job. That's what I can control.
And I think that's good, Stephen and Commander White, but you can control incentivization for police officers. You can control sending cars home. You can control a point system by virtue of where you live. You can control the educational thrust.
You can do other things.
There's some things we can do, but it has to be a priority of the department. And as the chief often says, leadership is the one that sets the pace from the top down.
Absolutely.
So if the leadership, if the head is not prioritizing that, Steve, if he is not saying that and his commanders are not also demonstrating by that, watch my example, I'm a preacher. When I go to the store, people come up to me, Reverend Anthony, I'm having a problem with my son. Can you help me? I take a moment to talk to them. I take a moment to, where I can get a job. I'm having a problem with my boy. Right. Same thing with police officers. Right. I don't know where these cats live. I mean, they don't live in my neighborhood. So I'm simply saying that it does make a difference where you live because you interact.
Because you interact in ways off the job that, sure. We have to take a quick break, but when we come back, I want to talk about how much of this is policy and how much of this is community in terms of solutions and moving forward with this.